Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where steel clanged, armor creaked, and people insisted on solving disagreements by waving sharpened metal near one another, usually with all the grace of a sleep-deprived goose. So get comfortable, let the world quiet down around you, and let's explore what knights really did with their weapons, which was, unsurprisingly, far less glamorous and far more awkward than Hollywood tends to promise. We're told that knights were these graceful, swirling heroes whose swords sang through the air like orchestral instruments. In reality, most swords sang the way a very disappointed kazoo does when someone sits on it. But knights made do with what they had, which included heavy armor, limited oxygen, sweaty padding, and the general hope that no one stabbed them through a hole they forgot about. Because there were always holes. Someone always found one. Let's settle into the pace. Slow, steady, and gentle, the way a medieval scribe might slowly give up on writing an elegant manuscript after realizing he had to draw yet another marginal cat. So, knights and their weapons. A topic that seems heroic, but in practice looked more like two overdressed men trying to politely shove each other into the ground for several minutes. Chroniclers described battles as furious encounters of steel. Most of them, of course, were watching from a hill while absolutely refusing to get any closer, because chroniclers were smart enough to stay alive. The knights, meanwhile, were down in the mud, trying to lift their arms high enough to swing a sword with conviction while weighted down with a small metal apartment. You can almost imagine them, breathing through layers of quilted padding, thinking, I should have learned Latin. Or accounting. Anything else. The movies love the elegant sword swing, the big, high, dramatic arc that would be very impressive if knights had ever done anything that inefficient. In reality, knights tended to keep their sword movements tight, sharp, and as close to themselves as possible, mostly because they didn't want to expose the soft, fleshy parts that medieval armor inconveniently failed to cover. A knight raising his sword above his head for that heroic cinematic swing was like hanging up a large sign saying, "Dear enemy, please stab me in the armpit. I won't stop you." And trust me, enemies obliged. Armpits were very popular. Now, let's drift a little deeper. Imagine the field. Not the tidy movie battlefield, but a lumpy, muddy mess full of footprints, lost helmets, and a surprising number of turnips for absolutely no good reason. Knights rarely glided across the field. They trudged. Step, sink, step, sink. Slightly regret life choices. Step again. Their weapons, real weapons, weren't elegant toys. Swords were practical tools meant for very close encounters, ideally ones that ended with the other person collapsing politely and quickly so nobody had to sweat too much. Take the long sword. Movies show it slicing through armor like someone cutting through warm bread. In reality, armor was usually much tougher than bread, and significantly less cooperative. Swords weren't used to slice through steel. They were used to pry open the gaps between pieces, or to aim thrusts into convenient weak points like the throat, groin, or the aforementioned armpit, which, again, was historically quite unlucky. Knights used the half-sword technique far more often than the dramatic two-handed overhead swings. Half-swording involved gripping the blade halfway up, because the edges weren't razor-sharp the entire length. Hollywood forgot to mention that. When you watch a movie and see a character grip the middle of the blade, you might think, they're about to die. But no, knights did it all the time. It gave more control when stabbing into joints or wrestling in the mud, which, inconveniently, accounted for a very large percentage of medieval combat situations. Anytime you picture a knight slashing back and forth in big, clean arcs, feel free to replace that vision with a man awkwardly shoving a metal stick into another man while trying not to trip on a surprisingly aggressive patch of grass. And then we have shields, those big Hollywood frisbees knights apparently threw across the battlefield whenever it was narratively convenient. Historical knights did not throw their shields. Shields were expensive, usually custom-fitted, and often the single most important thing keeping them alive. Tossing one across the field would be the medieval equivalent of throwing your phone into the ocean because someone slightly annoyed you. Yes, it makes a statement. No, it is not wise. So knights held onto their shields like someone holding their last snack during a long night shift, tightly, protectively, and with the quiet understanding that losing it meant a very bad time ahead. But even shields weren't the elegant things we imagine. They got heavy. They got dented. They got stuck in things, surprisingly often. There were battles where knights needed squires to help them unwedge their shields from a particularly uncooperative enemy helmet. Meanwhile, the enemy usually stood there thinking, I don't get paid enough for this. Let's drift quietly into the ways knights used their other beloved weapons. The mace, for instance, a delightful tool for people who had given up on subtlety entirely. If a sword was like a gentleman's argument, a mace was like a very decisive, "You know what, never mind, we're doing this the simple way." Knights loved maces. They required no finesse. Just a straightforward swing and a very strong arm. The movies rarely show knights flailing around, trying to get enough momentum behind their mace without accidentally hitting their own horse. But it happened. A lot. Horses had opinions about this. None of them were positive. Speaking of horses, the warhorse was another victim of cinematic exaggeration. Movies depict them as sleek, elegant creatures galloping majestically across the field. Real medieval warhorses were shorter, sturdier, and built less for beauty and more for, "I will absolutely run straight into that man because my rider says so." They were essentially furry siege engines. Knights fought from horseback less often than we imagine, and far more cautiously. Charging full speed into a wall of spears was good theater, but a questionable life choice. Most cavalry engagements were far slower and more measured, with knights approaching, testing, circling, looking for a weakness, all while hoping their horse didn't decide it would much rather be eating grass somewhere far, far away. As we settle deeper into the story, let's drift to the spear, a weapon knights actually used far more than swords. Spears were practical, versatile, and had the fantastic advantage of allowing you to stand a comfortable distance away from the person trying to harm you. Which seems reasonable. Spears were cheap, replaceable, and worked for both mounted and foot combat. Hollywood rarely shows knights using them outside of jousting tournaments, because spears lack the glamorous cinematic sparkle of swords. But knights adored them. Farmers adored them too. Really, everyone adored not being stabbed back. This is the gentle reality of knightly combat, closer, slower, muddier, and far sweatier than the screen portrays. Let's drift over to another charming misconception, that armor weighed 100 pounds and knights could barely move in it. This persistent myth likely originated from people who never actually wore armor, but enjoyed confidently writing about it anyway. Proper plate armor was surprisingly flexible. Knights could run, roll, climb, and, with enough motivation, even vault onto a horse without assistance. They weren't delicate statues. They were mobile, well-protected fighters who just happened to jingle slightly. The idea that if a knight fell over, he would lie there helplessly like a stranded turtle is, sadly, not true. Though the turtle image is admittedly adorable. Still, knights stood up all the time. If they couldn't, most battles would have ended with everyone rolling around aimlessly. And speaking of rolling around, let's drift gently toward grappling. Yes, knights wrestled. A lot. Medieval combat manuals include entire sections dedicated to grabbing, tripping, hooking, and generally attempting to throw your opponent into the nearest inconvenient patch of terrain. Knights grappled with daggers, grappled with swords, grappled while holding shields, and occasionally grappled while hoping nobody noticed their helmet had fallen off and rolled away like a disappointed tin pumpkin. Wrestling in armor was exhausting. Imagine jogging in 3 winter coats, then doing a full wrestling match while holding a metal bar. That gives you a rough idea. Knights were strong because they had to be. If they weren't, they simply didn't remain knights for very long. It's rather Darwinian. Whenever you see a movie with elegant backflips, spinning kicks, and unnecessary twirling, feel free to gently exhale and let that image drift away. Replace it with 2 armored men slowly wrestling each other for control, both sweating profusely and probably regretting lunch. We can drift to polearms next, the halberd, the poleaxe, the glaive. These were the medieval equivalents of, "I want to stay alive," and also "I want them to stop living," and preferably from several feet away. Knights loved poleaxes. They were like Swiss army knives for ruining someone's day, a spike for thrusting, an axe for chopping, and a hammer for dealing with armor that did not wish to be chopped. Poleaxes required skill, strength, and a remarkable amount of trust that the person behind you wouldn't accidentally swing theirs too widely. And yes, people got hit by their allies more often than they'd like to admit. As you relax, you might wonder, did knights ever fight the way movies show? The swirling, spinning, acrobatic dance of blades? Not really. Not unless they tripped. Medieval fighting manuals, the real ones, emphasize angles, leverage, footwork, and using the weapon like a tool, not a toy. Knights weren't trying to look good. They were trying to stay alive. A small but important distinction Hollywood tends to skip. Let's drift gently toward the end of this part. But first, a little musing for you. If you were a medieval knight, tired, sweaty, overheated, holding a sword you didn't really want to replace because it cost half a year's income, how long do you think you'd last in actual combat? It's a soothing question, really. Tell me in the comments. Would you have been a sword knight? A spear knight? Or one of the sensible ones who stayed home? And with that, let's drift quietly toward part 2. Whenever you're ready, of course. Let's drift back in. Slowly. Like we're easing into a warm bath that was drawn slightly too early and is now pleasantly lukewarm, the perfect temperature for questioning your life choices while nodding off. Tonight, we're continuing our meander through the quiet, unglamorous, occasionally ridiculous realities of how knights actually used their weapons. Not the sparkling, choreographed fantasy versions, but the real, muddy, sweaty, surprisingly practical tools of medieval survival. The kinds of weapons that rarely shimmered, but definitely thudded. We ended part 1 with the honest truth that knights did not whirl around like ballerinas with anger issues. Instead, they tended to fight in close, uncomfortable, deeply personal proximity, the sort that modern humans might reserve for crowded elevators or arguments about thermostats. And that's the image to keep in mind as we drift forward, armored men standing very close, doing very unpleasant things to one another, while trying not to fall over. Now, let's deepen the story by looking at the weapon most people think they know, yet almost always misunderstand, the sword. But not the long sword this time. Tonight, we're drifting toward its slightly grumpier cousin, the arming sword. Shorter, simpler, and much more frequently used. The arming sword was the medieval equivalent of a reliable pocket knife. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just there. Useful. Dependable. The sort of weapon that didn't try to impress anyone. A sword you might describe as polite. Knights carried these everywhere. On horseback. On foot. In battle. In camp. Possibly even to the medieval equivalent of a grocery store. They weren't slicing through plate armor with them. Plate was not known for cooperating, but they were excellent for cutting into gambesons, padding, and the general unprotected bits that human beings are full of. A knight in the thick of battle might have found himself gripping his arming sword like a man gripping a particularly determined kitchen knife, hoping it would put in a good word with fate. But between the sword and the knight stood one often forgotten barrier, the gauntlet. Anyone who has worn thick leather gloves knows that fine motor skills disappear rapidly, often replaced with the dexterity of a sleepy otter. Medieval gauntlets were worse. They protected the hand beautifully but made it difficult to do, well, anything requiring precision. The idea that knights parried delicate blade movements is adorable. In reality, they mostly hacked, pushed, and redirected force using broader motions. A knight's hand was safe, but not nimble. If you've ever tried to type wearing oven mitts, you understand the struggle. The sword was far from the only weapon knights relied upon. In fact, for many knights, it was a backup, the medieval equivalent of switching to your sidearm when your main tool became inconvenient. Their main tool? More often than not, it was the lance. And not the elegant jousting lance of fairy tales, but a sturdier, heavier battlefield lance designed not to shatter dramatically but to impale someone very firmly and very unpoetically. Hollywood justs always end with the lance exploding in a satisfying spray of splinters. Medieval lances did break, yes, but usually not in such a theatrical way. Knights didn't appreciate losing the weapon they paid for. So their lances had a different purpose. Get one good hit during a charge. Just one. Enough to unseat or disable someone. And then, once the lance was no longer useful, the knight calmly dropped it, drew another weapon, and continued fighting. No slow-motion splinter showers necessary. Imagine the rhythm of it all, a line of armored riders, quiet breathing beneath helmets, a slow gathering of momentum, then the unmistakable thud of lance on shield or lance on armor. And then, silence again, except for the clanking of armor and the grunts of men trying not to topple over while their horses questioned their career paths. Let's drift from horseback to the ground, because most battles eventually turned into ground combat whether the knights liked it or not. Horses were expensive, temperamental, and prone to developing sudden opinions about being anywhere near sharp objects. Some ran. Some reared. Some simply sat down and refused to proceed, channeling the energy of a stubborn donkey who knows you can't make it move if it doesn't feel like it. On the ground, knights found themselves relying heavily on pole weapons. The poleaxe, for instance, was a favorite, a perfect blend of sharp edges and bludgeoning mass, mounted on a handle long enough to make enemies reconsider their proximity. Knights trained extensively with poleaxes because they needed a tool that could do everything: stab, cut, hook, drag, punch, and occasionally serve as a walking stick when exhaustion set in. The poleaxe did not sparkle, but it got results. It was the medieval multi-tool for both ruining and preventing other people's plans. When knights fought each other with poleaxes, it wasn't the cinematic dance of sparks you might imagine. Instead, it was more like two heavily armored blacksmiths arguing with construction equipment. They pushed. They pulled. They hooked the opponent's limbs, helmets, and joints. They drove spikes into visors. They used the hammer side to dent armor so deeply that removing it later required tools, patience, and occasionally swearing. Watching two knights poleaxe fight would not have looked graceful. It would have looked like two determined anvils attempting to outstubborn each other. And yet, despite all this heaviness, real medieval combat involved remarkable discipline. Knights trained in controlled techniques because their own armor could betray them if they moved carelessly. Lifting a weapon too high meant exposing a gap. Swinging too widely meant losing balance. Being too aggressive meant running into someone's waiting dagger, which was always ready for a moment of opportunity. Daggers were the quiet killers of medieval combat. Hollywood rarely shows them, except as decorative belt accessories. In reality, a knight's dagger, often a rondel dagger, was their final, intimate solution. Used in grappling, in close quarters, in the desperate slowness of ground fighting. Knights targeted the small, terrifying gaps in armor: the neck, the visor, the groin, the back of the knee, the inside of the elbow. It was not glamorous. It was not heroic. It was practical, efficient, and hauntingly real. Two armored men rolling in the dirt, each trying to drive a dagger through the other's protective layers. It was far removed from swirling swordplay. It was more like intensely competitive medieval hug fighting with very high stakes. Let's drift to shields again, because knights loved them more than movies want you to believe. They did not discard shields lightly. A shield was life insurance. A shield was comfort. A shield was the medieval equivalent of bringing an umbrella to a storm: sensible, slightly inconvenient, and absolutely necessary. Shields absorbed blows, redirected force, and created small breathing spaces in the chaos of battle. Knights used them not just to block, but to punch, shove, trip, and ram. A shield was a weapon all its own. Despite the stereotype, shields weren't impossibly heavy. Most weighed between 6 and 12 pounds, manageable even for someone wearing armor. But after hours of fighting, hours of blocking, absorbing impacts, and pushing against opponents, even a light shield became an oppressively heavy partner. Knights' arms trembled. Their stamina waned. Their grip weakened. The shield that had once offered protection now demanded endurance. By the end of a long engagement, many knights didn't so much wield their shields as carry them out of obligation. Let's wander softly into the topic of armor fatigue. Plate armor, though well-designed, still took a toll. Imagine wearing several layers of padded linen under rigid steel, sweating into it until the padding became a personal swamp, and trying to breathe through a helmet that only let fresh air in if you were lucky. Knights overheated. They dehydrated. Their muscles cramped. They developed headaches. They got dizzy. Armor was protection, but it was also a test, one that lasted as long as the battle did. And yet the myth persists that knights were immobile juggernauts, clanging around like overturned teapots. No, they were athletes, conditioned to move in armor, trained to strike, react, and endure. But even the fittest knight could only take so much. After an hour of fighting in full armor, the average knight wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about water. He was thinking about sitting down. He was possibly thinking about becoming a monk. Let's drift a little deeper, to the moment after battles. Knights sitting in tents, armor removed, padding drenched, faces red, hair plastered to their heads. They examined dents, scratches, and holes. They checked joints for bruises. They complained about chafing in extremely unfortunate places. They asked their squires to fetch water, or ale, or the medieval equivalent of ibuprofen in cup form. Weapons, too, had their aftermath. Swords bent. Spears splintered. Poleaxes notched. Maces dented. Everything needed to be repaired because a knight rarely fought just once. Medieval campaigns were long. Battles were not isolated events but moments in drawn-out conflicts full of waiting, marching, and wondering whether today was the day someone accidentally stabbed themselves trying to tie a strap. Knights weren't constantly fighting. Most of the time, they were waiting, thinking, polishing equipment, practicing, complaining about weather, sharpening blades while gently wishing they could go home. The movies skip this part because it's slow, quiet, and deeply human, which is exactly why we linger here. Knights were men. They were tired. They were anxious. They had doubts. They were not heroes leaping across tabletops. They were professionals doing a dangerous job and hoping, sincerely, that the next battle would be kind to them. And as you relax a little deeper, imagine the knight's internal monologue, muffled inside a steel helmet. Please don't let me fall in the mud again. Everyone saw last time. It was embarrassing. Let's drift toward the end of this part. Gently, like a knight slowly lowering his sword after realizing the enemy isn't charging after all. Just a few more soft steps. Knights fought with tools, not props. They fought in slow, grinding, uncomfortable ways. Their weapons were heavy, their armor hotter than anything you'd want near your skin, and the battlefield was rarely a place of glory. But in its quiet way, that makes their world more fascinating, not less. More human. More relatable. More real. And before we drift into part 3, here's a question to ponder as your eyelids grow just a little heavier. If you lived back then, truly back then, which weapon would you trust to keep you alive? A practical spear? A sturdy shield? A dagger for close moments? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious which medieval tool you'd choose. Let's drift back into the armor. Slowly, the way a knight might lower himself into yet another long day of unavoidable responsibilities. Tonight, we continue our quiet wander through the reality of medieval combat, not the glittering fantasy version, but the real, sometimes clumsy, always sweaty experience of knights simply trying to stay alive while carrying more metal than a modern gym's weight rack. If part 2 gave us the broader rhythm and fatigue of battle, part 3 lets us slip into the subtler, quieter spaces, the movements between blows, the pauses between chaos, the deeply unglamorous little details you never see on screen. Because if there's one thing medieval combat had in abundance, it was small, awkward truths nobody bothered to paint in illuminated manuscripts. Too much effort, probably. So let's settle our minds like a knight settling into his helmet, slowly, resentfully, and with a faint hope that no new dents will appear today. And let's drift deeper into the calm, surprisingly methodical world of fighting not to win gloriously, but simply to avoid dying embarrassingly. Knights, for all their bulky metal and elaborate titles, were first and foremost students of movement. Not dramatic movement. None of that spinning, flipping, twirling nonsense invented by directors who apparently believe physics is optional, but slow, controlled, grounded movement. A knight knew that lunging too far forward meant falling. Overreaching meant exposing a gap. Losing balance meant losing everything. Their fighting style wasn't a performance. It was a quiet conversation with gravity. Movies love wide, sweeping sword strokes that cut down 3 enemies in one elegant gesture. Real knights did not. Real knights kept their movements small, tight, and economical, because armor punished dramatic gestures with either exhaustion or a sudden hole in your torso. You almost get the sense that knights fought with the same energy you use when you get up at 3 a.m. to turn off a kitchen light you forgot about. Minimal, muttering, and slightly annoyed. Let's drift to one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval combat: footwork. Modern depictions show knights stomping heavily, as if every step produced a metallic thunderclap. In reality, knights had to move quietly, or at least as quietly as armor allowed. Footwork mattered. Sliding, stepping, shifting weight. A knight's greatest weapon, after all, was not his sword. It was his balance. Combat manuals from the time described subtle weight transfers and pivots. They emphasize posture, not the stiff, chest-out hero posture, but a relaxed, knees-bent stance. One that let the knight react, dodge, turn, and occasionally back away in a dignified retreat. Well, mostly dignified. Sometimes the retreat looked suspiciously like panic wearing a helmet. Knights learned how to stand so they wouldn't topple when someone slammed a shield into them. They learned how to brace for impact without locking their knees. They learned how to step into a blow instead of away from it, because stepping away risked losing footing. Armor helped, yes, but it also demanded respect. You didn't fight against your armor. You cooperated with it, like a man politely negotiating with a stubborn door hinge. Now, let's drift toward helmets, because if there's one piece of equipment that transformed a knight's experience, it was the helm. Heavy, enclosed, echoing. Everything inside sounded louder. The clang of a sword hitting the visor. The rasp of your own breathing. The heartbeat thudding behind your ears. Wearing a helmet for long periods created a small, private world, dark, confined, and slightly moist from your own breath. A knight inside a helmet fought half the battle against the opponent and half against the claustrophobic knowledge that his field of vision now resembled a very judgmental mailbox slot. Helmets limited vision so severely that the idea of a knight performing sweeping, peripheral-defying cinematic spins becomes completely absurd. A knight could only see what was directly in front of him. Anything to the side was a guess. Anything behind him was a prayer. And anything below his line of sight, like a sneaky trip hazard or an enemy who had inconveniently fallen over, required physically bending at the waist. Which, in armor, was about as graceful as watching a refrigerator bow politely. So knights kept their heads steady, their movements controlled, their choices simple. They didn't whirl around to check behind them. They turned fully, slowly, purposefully. The world moved in small fragments of visibility, not sweeping panoramas. Now, let's drift to the battlefield soundtrack. We think of clashes, metal hitting metal with a romantic ring. Real combat. It sounded more like muffled thunks, heavy breathing, dull impacts, and the occasional mutter that probably translated to, "Not this again." Swords hitting armor didn't spark. They didn't sing. They made noises like someone hitting a stew pot with a spoon, unsatisfying, anticlimactic, and more painful than dramatic. The clash of shields created hollow booms. Poleaxes struck with a crunch. Footsteps squished in mud. Horses snorted. Men shouted instructions or warnings that were sometimes heard and often ignored. A battlefield was not the orchestra the movies claim. It was a tired, chaotic percussion section played by men who desperately wanted a nap. Let's drift into the topic of time, because battles lasted longer than people expect. Not in one cinematic burst, but in slow waves. Advances. Retreats. Pauses. Knights didn't fight continuously for 10 straight minutes. They would collapse. Instead, they fought in short bursts. 30 seconds here. A minute there. Then a pause, to breathe, reposition, survive. Combat was endurance. Not explosive fitness, but long-term stamina, the kind shaped by carrying metal on your shoulders and worrying constantly about the next arrow. Arrows, by the way, deserve their own quiet moment. Knights were not immune to arrows. Plate armor helped, yes, but gaps existed. And longbowmen and crossbowmen knew these gaps intimately, with almost suspicious enthusiasm. Arrows could slip into joints, visors, armpits. They found the weak spots like water finding cracks in old wood. And nothing broke a knight's heroic swagger faster than realizing he had been shot in a location the squire would not enjoy bandaging later. Crossbows hit harder. They didn't care about armor as much. A good crossbow bolt could punch through steel or lodge itself deeply enough to ruin one's afternoon. Knights feared crossbows in a private, quiet way, much like modern people fear unexpected emails from their boss. No drama, just dread. Let's drift to another uncomfortable truth. Knights often fought dismounted. Movies rarely show this because it makes knights look less glamorous and more like very well-dressed infantry. But dismounted fighting was common. Horses were too valuable to risk in chaos. Many commanders preferred their knights to fight on foot where they wouldn't wander off, fall, or get confused about which way the battle was going. Horses, after all, did not attend strategy meetings. On foot, knights formed tight lines. Shields locked. Polearms out. Quiet, disciplined formations. Less glorious. More effective. Knights were trained not just to duel, but to work as a team, each man covering the gaps of the men beside him. A shield wall made individual skill less important than collective stability. A knight couldn't win a line battle with fancy blade flourishes. He won by standing his ground and not letting the formation break. The movies show one knight charging into many enemies because it looks heroic. In real life, that knight would be tackled, overwhelmed, and possibly stepped on. Medieval combat was not an action movie. It was a team sport played with terrible equipment. Let's drift now into the quieter moments knights rarely got credit for, the tactical thinking. Despite stereotypes, knights weren't mindless brutes. Many were trained in strategy. They studied terrain. They read about previous battles. They learned the basics of leading troops. Some were brilliant. Some were mediocre. Some were, frankly, disasters waiting for an opportunity to happen. A knight might choose to stand on a hill not for dramatic silhouette purposes, but because it made cavalry charges harder to execute against them. He might position infantry near marshy ground not because he enjoyed mud, but because enemy knights would sink. He might refuse to chase retreating foes because doing so was the #1 way to run straight into an ambush. Knights weren't taught to be reckless. They were taught to be practical. And yet the myth persists that knights were all arrogance and no awareness. True, some were arrogant, enough to fill several chronicles with stories of noblemen who refused advice with the phrase, "I know what I'm doing," moments before not knowing what they were doing. But many knights were thoughtful, calculating, and surprisingly cautious. The armor gave confidence, yes, but it also reminded them of risk. A knight could afford one mistake. Possibly two. But not three. Let's drift quietly into the topic of fear. Knights experienced it more often than we imagine. Not terror, necessarily, but a low, constant thrum of anxiety beneath the metal. A worry about blind spots. A worry about arrows. A worry about tripping. A worry about facing someone stronger, faster, or simply having a better day. They wore armor to protect themselves, not to advertise invincibility. Combat didn't just bruise bodies. It bruised egos. The humiliation of falling. The embarrassment of losing grip on a weapon. The sting of being saved by a squire. Knights lived in a world where reputation mattered deeply, and a single moment of clumsiness could become a favorite joke around the fire pit for weeks. Imagine sitting in full armor while your fellow knights say, "Remember when Sir Robert tripped over that shield and took down 3 men on his way to the ground?" And knowing they will repeat this story 100 times, each retelling slightly more dramatic. Let's float to the end of part 3, gently, like a knight lowering himself onto a wooden bench after a long day, grateful just to sit. Knights were not the cinematic heroes we're shown today. They were human, tired, methodical, often cautious, sometimes brilliant, sometimes unfortunate. Their combat was not a dance. It was a quiet struggle for survival, fought with discipline, balance, and an unspoken agreement with fate. And now, as you rest your thoughts, here's something to ponder softly. If you were placed on a medieval battlefield, armor, weapons, exhaustion and all, which part would challenge you the most? The vision-limiting helmet? The constant weight? The heat? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious which medieval misery you think would bother you first. Let's drift back into the soft shadows of the battlefield, where the armor glints faintly in the low morning light and every knight is quietly reconsidering his life choices. By now you probably realize that the romance of medieval combat is, well, mostly invented by people who never had to hold a weapon heavier than a quill. But we can keep floating through it. Slowly. Sleepily. With all the gentle disappointment appropriate for this entire topic. We left off with the notion that knights, despite all the shiny depictions, weren't actually trying to slice each other open like overripe melons. Their swords were more like multipurpose tools, and their actual battlefield intentions were more economic than heroic. Killing the enemy was fine. But capturing the enemy? That was early retirement. That was passive income before passive income was cool. So as we drift into this next stretch of the medieval landscape, just settle in and imagine the clank of armor not as the soundtrack of glory, but as the weary percussion of professional men trying very hard not to lose fingers. You might be curious about how knights actually interacted once their weapons were in hand. Hollywood would have you believe it was one dramatic sweep after another, sparks flying like someone set off fireworks at a jousting tournament. But real combat was slower, heavier, more thoughtful, though seldom in an intellectual sense. The armor made them move like overworked turtles who had too many expectations placed upon them. Even lifting a foot took effort. And so did swinging a sword. The sword was rarely swung in those long cinematic arcs. It was more like short, sharp bursts. Efficient, practical, and absolutely devoid of flair. Which, in fairness, describes most real knights rather well. And if you ever wondered why medieval manuscripts sometimes show knights gripping the blade of their own sword while trying to stab someone, that's because they really did. The technique is called half-swording. It wasn't a mistake. They didn't forget what swords are for. It was simply the best way to aim a very precise, armor-penetrating thrust into the gaps of another knight's protection. Armor was good. Too good, sometimes. A normal slash would bounce off like you were gently patting a metal barrel. So instead, they choked up on the sword like it was a very annoyed crowbar. It's not elegant, but it worked. And medieval combat was about results, not aesthetics. Much like medieval dentistry. But armor wasn't only a passive defense. It changed the rhythm of a fight entirely. You moved differently because you had to think differently. You couldn't dodge the same way. You couldn't step aside quickly. You couldn't roll unless you wanted to resemble a particularly troubled hedgehog. So combat became a dance of angles and leverage. Which sounds very refined, until you realize most of that dance occurred in mud, with men breathing loudly through their helmets, smelling like they'd been wearing the same padded underthings since, well, forever. Because they often had. Now, movies do get one thing right. Knights were loud. The armor clinked, scraped, rattled, and occasionally squeaked. Some suits were well-fitted masterpieces. Some were definitely not. Imagine fighting in a metal outfit that doesn't quite bend when you bend. Imagine an armpiece that decides, at the worst possible moment, to pinch. Or a wrist guard that locks up halfway through a swing. There's no reason to romanticize this. Even knights didn't. They were proud of their armor, but they weren't under any illusions about its comfort. It's one of the many reasons why battles were often short. Everyone just wanted to go home, sit down, and stop sweating. Let's drift over to how mounted combat actually worked. Because movies adore showing those wide, sweeping cavalry charges that hit like tidal waves. And while charges did happen, they weren't nearly as common or as decisive as storytellers like to pretend. War horses were powerful, but they weren't suicidal. You couldn't convince a fully trained destrier to crash itself into a solid wall of braced spears. Horses have instincts. And those instincts usually said, absolutely not. A cavalry charge succeeded only when the enemy formation was already unstable, frightened, moving backward, or doing something else that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices. And yes, the knight's lance could absolutely unhorse an opponent. But that was usually because both riders were aiming directly at each other and traveling at enough speed to make Newton raise an eyebrow. Lances in real combat broke constantly. That was expected. They were designed to break, in fact. Much safer than having a big heavy wooden pole remain intact and launch itself through your torso. Even medieval people found that too dramatic. Once the lance shattered, the knight switched immediately to the sword or mace. But again, it's not the elegant blade work you see in film. The sword in mounted combat was more of a directional tool used to slash at the unarmored bits of whoever was unfortunate enough to be nearest. A simple downward chop to the shoulder or back. Maybe a strike toward a fleeing opponent's leg. It wasn't complex. It was practical, the way medieval life tended to be when people weren't writing poems about imaginary heroics. Speaking of imaginary heroics, let's drift gently toward the longbow. The longbow is often described with an awe usually reserved for divine interventions or particularly good pastries. But it wasn't mystical. It was simply efficient. And the reason it was efficient is that longbowmen trained from childhood. Their skeletons literally adapted to the strain. Archaeologists can spot a longbowman because his spine and shoulders look like he spent his entire life pulling on something that didn't want to move. Which he did. Their arrows could pierce armor at the right angle and distance, but it wasn't guaranteed. More often, the longbow did its best work against horses, lightly armored troops, and anyone foolish enough to mill around without a shield. A rain of arrows could break formations, panic soldiers, and tip a battle long before the knights ever arrived to claim credit they didn't fully deserve. Which, to be fair, is one of history's favorite running jokes. Let's drift now to one of the more misunderstood weapons, the spear. If medieval warfare had a Most Underrated Tool award, the spear would win without competition. Cheap to make, easy to use, terrifying in groups. And because no one likes to admit they were killed by something as boring as a long stick, chroniclers tended to focus heavily on swords instead. But the spear was the real workhorse of the battlefield. Swords were backup weapons. Spears were the main event. Spear formations could stop cavalry. They could push back other infantry. They could hold ground longer than any individual knight ever could. Knightly chronicles tended to avoid overemphasizing this, because it spoiled the narrative. But reality isn't obligated to be flattering. As we float farther into the quieter corners of medieval violence, we should also talk about fatigue. Because warfare, for all its noise and chaos, was mostly about exhaustion. Men got tired quickly. Swinging a weapon repeatedly is draining. Doing it while wearing armor is worse. Doing it while trying not to die is worst of all. Most men fought for a few minutes before retreating behind the line to catch their breath. The idea of battle as one long continuous engagement is, well, dramatic nonsense. Combat happened in bursts. Retreats. Re-engagements. More retreats. Think of it like interval training but with significantly less optimism. The quiet truth is that knights weren't superhuman. They were trained, yes, but training doesn't erase physics. You get tired. Your sword gets heavy. Your visor fogs up. Sweat trickles in very unhelpful places. After a while, your beautifully crafted armor feels like a small portable prison. A very expensive prison, but still a prison. Fighting while tired means mistakes. And mistakes mean someone gets captured, injured, or stepped on by a horse with no patience for human nonsense. Let's drift over to something more psychological. Knights like to pretend that battle was glorious, but their pep talks before a fight sound suspiciously like men trying to convince themselves that this isn't a terrible idea. They had religious rituals, of course. Blessing swords. Praying. Sometimes confessing. A few even made peace with old enemies, just in case. These moments of sincerity don't often show up in stories because they clash with the whole invincible knight aesthetic. But they were human. Nervous. Sometimes shaking behind their shields. It's strangely comforting, in a sleepy sort of way, to imagine that even men in shining armor shook with nerves while waiting for a horn to sound. History is full of bravado, but also full of people quietly terrified beneath the bravado. And that feels very human. Very real. Very appropriate for late-night reflection. But drifting back to the practicalities, let's consider weapons that weren't swords or spears. Maces. War hammers. Axes. Tools designed very specifically to ruin the day of anyone wearing heavy armor. These were the can openers of medieval warfare. And no, they weren't brutally heavy like video games pretend. They were light. Fast. Designed to puncture or deform metal. Their elegance was in their simplicity, not in their weight. A heavy weapon is slow. A slow weapon is useless. Medieval people understood this better than we give them credit for. Axes, especially, were versatile. Designed for chopping, they transferred force well. A knight with an axe wasn't compensating for anything. He simply understood that sometimes the simplest tool gets the job done most efficiently. And really, that's the motto of the entire medieval battlefield. Efficiency over elegance. Results over flashiness. In the soft quiet of nighttime reflection, this reveals something strangely calming. Medieval combat wasn't the chaotic fury modern media portrays. It was controlled. Measured. The product of training, not passion. Practicality, not adrenaline. As we drift to the edge of this part, take a moment to imagine a battlefield not as a storm of constant violence, but as a series of slow, heavy motions punctuated by moments of sharp clarity. Knights stepping, breathing, thinking, adjusting grips, watching for openings. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And reality, despite lacking fireworks, is often more fascinating. If you were standing on that field, weapon in hand, armor weighing you down, what would you have done? Drift into the comments and tell me, quietly, of course. End of part 4. Tell me in the comments, which medieval weapon would you most not want to use? Let's drift back into the stillness around the battlefield, where the dust hangs low and everyone is reconsidering why medieval society thought this was a normal career path. By now, the romantic illusions have mostly worn off, and what remains is something much softer, slower, and admittedly more human than all the dramatic retellings. And that's where we'll stay for a while, just floating through the details, without rushing, without forcing anything, letting the facts settle like warm fog over old armor. We left off with knights moving in measured bursts, not wild cinematic flurries. So maybe it's time to think about what surrounded them. Because a medieval battlefield wasn't just knights and their preferred instruments of persuasion. It was a mixture. Layers. Textures of people, tools, sounds, and smells that modern imagination tends to tidy up far too much. Hollywood smooths the edges. Real life certainly did not. For example, if you picture a battlefield as only noble-born warriors charging each other in glorious fury, it might help to gently erase that image and replace it with something far more modest. Knights were a minority. Most fighting men were infantry, commoners, conscripts, or simply unfortunate enough to be standing in the wrong place when someone shouted, "To arms." They carried spears, bills, axes, farming tools that had been sharpened in ways their original manufacturers would have strongly discouraged. These were the main bodies of medieval armies. Not glamorous, but essential, much like the medieval equivalent of background staff who do all the work while nobles take credit. And these infantry formations mattered more than most modern audiences realize. A knight alone was impressive. A knight surrounded by a dozen properly arranged infantrymen was survivable. A knight surrounded by several hundred well-organized infantrymen was suddenly aware of his own mortality. And if those infantry happened to be pikemen, well, the knight's horse was aware of its own mortality too. Long spears, when used in groups, changed everything. A cavalry charge into disciplined infantry wasn't heroic. It was unwise. And horses, those brave but sensible animals, were not interested in volunteering for such tasks. Let's drift into the idea of formations, because formations were the quiet skeleton of medieval warfare. Not dramatic. Not flashy. But without them, armies collapsed faster than a rickety stool under a very optimistic sitter. The shield wall, for instance, was an ancient but reliable design. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping slightly, weapons ready to stab through gaps. Not thrilling. Not poetic. But incredibly effective when people actually held the line. Many battles were decided not by who had better weapons, but by who had stronger discipline, or who panicked last. Panicking early was something of a universal medieval hobby. And it wasn't always irrational. Imagine standing in the front rank, hearing an approaching cavalry force. The ground trembles. The air hums. Your brain begins inventing all sorts of worst-case scenarios. Someone coughs behind you. Someone else whispers a prayer they clearly didn't memorize all that well. Meanwhile, your shield, made of wood that has seen better days, feels suddenly inadequate. And your spear, perfectly respectable minutes ago, now looks like a twig that would struggle against an enthusiastic goose. Medieval armies broke not because they hated bravery, but because fear spreads quickly, and fighting requires energy most people ran out of after the first few minutes. And that brings us to something else. Medieval battles were short. Not because medieval people were lazy, but because the human body has limits. Even trained warriors tire quickly when every muscle is working overtime. The armor traps heat. The shield arm aches. The weapon arm begs for retirement. And the lungs? Well, the lungs sound like someone trying to suck soup through a very narrow straw. 2, maybe 3 intense clashes might happen before everyone needed to stop, breathe, and quietly question their life decisions. Let's drift over to the idea of noise. We often imagine battles as deafening, and at times they were. But they also had long stretches of eerie quiet. Marching quietly. Waiting quietly. Staring across a field quietly. Listening to the enemy doing the exact same thing. History's greatest battles often began with long minutes of mutual hesitation, because no one really wanted to be first. The first move meant exposing yourself. And the person who moved second had the advantage of reacting. Medieval commanders understood this, which is why many battles involved more waiting than fighting. It's not dramatic, but it's true. War was many things. Efficient, however, it was not. This next part is something films almost never portray: how soldiers communicated during battle. Orders had to be shouted, signaled with banners, or communicated through runners. Imagine trying to direct thousands of men using only flags and wishful thinking. Add terrain, dust, and the lingering possibility of, "I thought you meant left, not your left." Confusion was normal. Miscommunication was expected. And entire battles were lost because one group of men misunderstood an order shouted from too far away by someone who very clearly needed more coffee. Now let's drift toward the idea of exhaustion, real, bone-deep exhaustion. After a battle, medieval warriors didn't stroll triumphantly across a neatly organized field. They stumbled, gasped, collapsed, or crawled toward whatever water source was nearby. The aftermath wasn't triumphant victory poses. It was men sitting in the dirt trying to remove helmets that had been slowly cooking them from the inside. If they'd survived, that alone was worth quiet celebration. Victory wasn't clean either. Even triumphant armies had wounded to tend, equipment to gather, horses to calm, and a general sense of, "let's never do that again," which somehow never prevented them from doing it again. The spoils of war, though often exaggerated in stories, were mostly equipment, livestock, and sometimes ransoms if they happened to snag someone important. And even that required negotiation, paperwork, and the medieval equivalent of haggling, which is deeply unromantic but extremely human. Let's drift into sieges now, because sieges were the introvert's version of warfare. Instead of charging toward danger, you sat outside a castle and waited for people to run out of food or patience. Sieges were long, slow, dull, and absolutely miserable. Armies would camp around a fortress for weeks or months. Supplies dwindled. Water soured. Tempers frayed. Hygiene was, well, I'll spare the details, but let's just say no medieval doctor would approve. Inside the castle wasn't much better. Imagine hundreds of people crowded inside walls not built for that many bodies. Food shortages were common. Morale dipped. Boredom set in. And anything resembling comfort faded quickly. Modern people sometimes imagine castle life as luxurious. During a siege, luxury meant stale bread that didn't crumble entirely in your hands. Siege weapons also get a strange reputation. Films love showing massive trebuchets hurling flaming projectiles in elegant slow motion. In reality, trebuchets were engineering marvels, yes, but they were slow to load, prone to breaking, and often launched things that were not particularly cinematic. Sometimes large stones. Sometimes smaller stones. Sometimes whatever the engineers could find lying around. The goal wasn't style. It was irritation. Break the wall. Break morale. Make the defenders question why they didn't move somewhere with fewer enemies and better plumbing. But while we're gently floating through this, it helps to remember that most sieges didn't end in walls collapsing. Most ended through negotiation, starvation, or someone deciding that they'd rather surrender than continue living on root vegetables and questionable water. Medieval people valued survival over aesthetics far more than most period dramas give them credit for. Let's drift from walls to weather, because battles and sieges alike were held hostage by the weather. Rain turned fields into sticky traps. Mud swallowed boots. Horses slipped. Archers struggled with wet bowstrings. Chainmail rusted with alarming enthusiasm. A sudden storm could end a battle before it began. And commanders, without satellite images or apps, made decisions using only their eyes, their instincts, and the vague hope that the sky wasn't lying to them. Seasons dictated everything. Most wars paused during winter. Not because medieval people feared the cold, but because logistics feared the cold. Food didn't grow. Roads turned hostile. Horses weakened. And soldiers, who were already mildly grumpy in the best conditions, became significantly grumpier. So winter campaigns were rare, and usually involved armies becoming lost, hungry, or very reflective about their poor planning. Let's drift gently to the idea of decision-making. Commanders weren't omniscient. They didn't have perfect maps, scouts, or communication. They made judgments based on rumors, assumptions, and the occasional vague report from someone who had seen something that may or may not have been accurate. Decisions were often gambles. Some paid off. Some led to catastrophic blunders that later chroniclers politely glossed over. Everyone loves a heroic tale. Fewer people enjoy reading about the commander who misinterpreted a shadow on a hill and marched his tired army straight into a swamp. And then there were the banners. Every army had them, fluttering in the wind like very stressed fabric metaphors. Banners signaled who was where, which mattered immensely when armor obscured faces and everyone looked vaguely similar under a sallet or great helm. Lose your banner, and confusion erupted. Gain the enemy's banner, and morale soared. Banners were less about decoration and more about organization, though they did look quite nice when the sun hit them just right, assuming the sun cooperated. Now, as we continue drifting, let's glide back toward the individuals themselves. No matter how careful, trained, or disciplined they were, medieval soldiers weren't immune to fear. And fear didn't make them weak. It made them human. Chronicles often elevate courage as if fear didn't exist. But fear was everywhere, quiet, steady, shaping decisions and often preventing worse disasters. Caution saved lives more often than reckless bravery. You rarely hear that in stories, but it's true. Battles weren't constant motion. They were bursts, pauses, breaths. A rhythm, but not a musical one. More like the slow, uneven pattern of distant thunder. Men would fight. Step back. Breathe. Look around. Adjust grips. Brace again. Every moment filled with calculation. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't ballet. It was somewhere in between, a slow, heavy tension punctuated by short moments of clarity. And strangely, that slower rhythm makes everything feel a little more real. A little more grounded. And in a way, a little more calming, even as we examine warfare. Medieval combat wasn't a storm. It was a tide. Rolling in. Rolling out. Coming back. Fading again. As we drift toward the end of this part, imagine yourself standing just behind the line. Watching. Breathing. Feeling the weight of the moment. Knowing that everything depends on discipline, timing, and the willingness to stay put when instinct tells you to run. In those moments, what would you have done? Held the line, or followed instinct? Tell me softly in the comments. End of part 5. Let me know quietly in the comments. Would you have held your place in the formation, or slipped backward, just to check something like half the medieval army? Let's drift gently back onto the medieval road, where the morning fog hangs low, the fields are damp, and the knights we keep talking about are slowly realizing that all their training, all their bravery, and all their very shiny armor are going to come second to whatever chaos the day decides to roll their way. By now you may have noticed a theme. Most things knights did were far less heroic than the movies imply, and far more practical, awkward, sweaty, and filled with a kind of weary resignation that only lifelong responsibility can create. So let's float onward, nice and slow, exploring how these heavily armored men actually moved through the world, not only on battlefields, but in the hours before and after the noise. Because if combat was the main event, preparation was the real hidden storyline. Knights didn't simply leap into armor like superheroes stepping into CGI suits. They needed help. Quite a lot of help, actually. A fully equipped knight was basically a medieval team project. A squire, usually a teenager with more enthusiasm than sleep, had to buckle, tie, lift, arrange, pad, and occasionally negotiate with the armor itself, which always seemed to have its own mysterious preferences. A knight getting dressed was like watching a nobleman try to wrestle a highly opinionated metal puzzle that refused to cooperate. It could take 20 minutes on a good day. Much longer if the knight insisted on fussing over things like the angle of his spaulders or whether the vambrace pinched when he breathed too deeply. And then, of course, there was the padding. Hollywood never shows the padding. Probably because nobody wants to see a noble warrior stepping into thick, quilted undergarments that look suspiciously like an oversized oven mitt. But those thick, soft layers were essential. Without them, armor rubbed. It chafed. It dug. It pinched. The padding wasn't glamorous, but it kept men functional. And in battle, comfort, however relative, mattered. Let's drift a little deeper into the moment just before battle. You might imagine knights glancing toward the horizon with heroic resolve, but more often they were adjusting straps and trying to decide whether the dampness in their boots was from morning dew or something more concerning. The air inside a helmet wasn't great. It smelled of metal, breath, and whatever the knight had eaten that morning, stewing quietly. The visibility wasn't ideal either. Most helmets were designed for protection, not sightseeing. Peering through narrow slits was not exactly conducive to poetic inspiration. It was more like looking at the world through a pair of perpetually annoyed eyelids. Still, this was the reality they accepted. A knight in armor understood that comfort was a luxury. Honor, duty, and all those well-crafted ideas took precedence. Or at least that's what they told themselves while shifting their shoulders and silently hoping nothing important inside the armor was rubbing in ways that would be regretted later. As battle drew closer, discipline, not bravado, was what mattered. Knights fought in formation, not as lone warriors dancing between enemies like cinematic champions. If a knight broke formation, he didn't look heroic, he looked foolish. And often he became a story other knights told later to remind each other why discipline mattered. They might not have been poets, but knights knew the value of caution. The battlefield was chaotic, confusing, loud in ways that didn't feel glorious, only overwhelming. When the real fighting began, that chaos became a steady rhythm of impacts, shields clashing, armor scraping, boots thudding against mud. Modern storytelling loves the sound of steel ringing loudly each time swords meet, but knights avoided striking sword on sword whenever possible. That just damaged the weapon they paid far too much money for. They aimed at people, not swords. Preferably at unarmored spots. And if they couldn't find one, they looked for leverage, an arm pulled off balance, a shield pressed aside, a visor pushed upward at the wrong moment. That's the quiet truth. Knightly combat wasn't a dance of elegant strikes. It was close-quarters wrestling with sharp objects. You grabbed. You shoved. You used your shield like a battering tool. And yes, sometimes you tackled people. Knights weren't above that. If knocking someone down was the easiest option, they went for it. Gravity usually did the rest. But let's drift onward to something rarely discussed, how knights communicated in the middle of all this. The answer is surprisingly boring. They shouted. A lot. But once helmets were on and the world became a metallic echo chamber, shouting had mixed results. Some commands were heard clearly. Others were heard partially. Some were not heard at all and resulted in a confused cluster of armored men all doing slightly different things and pretending it was the plan the whole time. The battlefield was not a symphony. It was a mildly chaotic group project where everyone was trying their best. Let's drift to something softer. Something knights experienced far more often than battle: waiting. Campaigns were mostly waiting. Marching. Eating whatever rations hadn't spoiled. Checking their gear. Standing around listening to passionate speeches that sounded impressive but didn't change anyone's mood. A knight spent far more time being bored than being brave. Chroniclers usually skipped those parts, because, and then they waited for 8 days while nothing interesting happened, does not make for captivating reading. But boredom shaped medieval warfare as much as any sword stroke. During these long waits, knights trained. Not in dramatic, acrobatic swordplay, but in basics. Footwork. Shield handling. How to hold a weapon without exhausting themselves too quickly. They practiced maneuvering as a group, knowing that if they broke their line during a charge or advance, the whole formation could fall apart. The goal was rhythm, not flair. Predictability. Coordination. Not one-man heroics. You might think this sounds uneventful, and it was. But in the slow, sleepy way that defines much of medieval reality, this uneventful truth made all the difference. It kept them alive. It kept armies functioning. It was the quiet discipline behind the loud moments. Let's drift ahead now, past battle, into the aftermath, the part nobody romanticizes. The battlefield after the noise stopped wasn't a grand painting of victory. It was mud. It was exhaustion. It was knights removing their helmets and finally tasting fresh air after hours of breathing metal dust and warm, stagnant air. Some celebrated. Some knelt to pray. Some simply sat down and stayed there, not because they were overcome with emotion but because their legs insisted on a break. And there were the wounded. Many survived because armor worked. A dented plate is still a plate. A cut gambeson still absorbs impact. Medieval medicine was not great, unless leeches and prayers are your preferred treatment plan, but armor did most of the work in preventing horrific injuries. Knights helped each other unbuckle armor to check bruises, cuts, sprains. Some injuries were hidden until the padding was removed, revealing dark marks where the force of a blow had crushed flesh but not broken bone. Painful, yes. Fatal, usually not. As we drift beyond the fighting entirely, let's look at how knights protected themselves during travel. Contrary to the myth of wandering champions always armored and ready, no one wore full plate to ride from one town to another. That was impractical in ways even medieval people wouldn't tolerate. Knights traveled with armor stored carefully, often packed alongside tools for maintenance. Rust was a constant enemy. Moisture was a problem. A helmet left uncleaned after a rainstorm could greet its owner the next morning with a thin layer of rust that took frustrating amounts of effort to remove. Squires were responsible for most of this labor. They polished. They cleaned. They hammered out dents. They stitched padding. Knights themselves sometimes supervised with a mild air of men pretending they had contributed more than they actually had. Let's drift into one more often romanticized idea: duels. Hollywood loves one-on-one duels as the pinnacle of knightly valor, and while they did happen, they were not spontaneous, poetic events where two armored gentlemen exchanged witty remarks before clashing swords. Real duels were slow, methodical, more like legal proceedings than spontaneous fights. They had rules. They had witnesses. Sometimes they even had referees. A knight didn't duel for flair. He dueled to settle disputes, honor debts, or satisfy some tedious requirement of medieval legal culture. And yes, they were less dramatic than expected. Because armor made both combatants hard to injure, duels often devolved into long, tiring grappling sessions. One knight might pin another. One might break his opponent's weapon. Sometimes a duel ended simply because one knight couldn't stand up anymore. It was less epic showdown, and more two men slowly discovering the limits of their physical endurance while everyone else watched politely. There's something almost comforting about this. The medieval world may have had its harsh moments, but its heroes were still human. Their limitations were real. Their fatigue was real. Their awkwardness was real. Beneath the armor, they were just people trying to do their best in a world that expected far too much from them. So as we drift to the end of this part, imagine once more a quiet moment on a field after the fighting. A knight sitting on the ground, helmet off, hair damp with sweat, breathing slowly as the evening breeze cools the air. His armor is dented. His padding is soaked. He probably smells terrible. But he survived. He is tired, hungry, and desperate for a bath that won't exist for at least another week. And yet, somehow, he still believes he lived up to the expectations of chivalry. In a strange way, that belief, the quiet, stubborn conviction, is what made knights who they were. Not glory. Not perfect skill. Just endurance. Persistence. A willingness to shoulder responsibility even when it was heavy. Literally and figuratively. Before we drift onward to the next part, let me ask you softly. If you were a medieval knight, which part of this life do you think would exhaust you the most? Let me know in the comments, if you're still awake. Let's drift gently back into the medieval haze, where the clang of steel has softened into memory and the battlefield sits in that familiar twilight between myth and reality. By now, you've probably settled into the rhythm of this world: slow-moving knights, slightly confused horses, and weapons that behaved very differently than the dramatic fantasies we like to imagine. So for this next segment, let's just keep wandering through the details, the quieter truths, the oddly soothing corners of a past that loved spectacle but lived in practicality. We ended last time somewhere between the weight of weapons and the reality that most medieval combat was slower, more methodical, and far more exhausting than heroic tales let on. It wasn't a beautiful ballet of steel, more like a cautious shuffle through danger while hoping your helmet didn't fog up at a crucial moment. So let's drift onward, soft and unhurried, into the next layer of medieval martial life, the things knights didn't want you to think too hard about. One of those things was the sheer amount of awkwardness involved when combatants wore full armor. We like to picture knights moving gracefully, like they were trained dancers wrapped in steel. But in reality, even well-fitted plate armor turned everyone into a slightly disgruntled tin can. They could run, yes. They could maneuver, yes. But doing anything quickly or delicately was a different story. If you've ever tried tying your shoes while wearing a winter coat that's one size too small, just expand that feeling across your entire body. That's medieval armor. Movable, functional, but always slightly annoying. For example, mounting a horse in full armor? Not the smooth, action hero leap we see in films. More like a careful, dignified wobble, relying heavily on stirrups, the groom's assistance, and the hope that nobody was watching. And once on the horse, you'd adjust and readjust your body weight like someone trying to get comfortable on a seat that wasn't designed by a human. Because, frankly, saddles were more about utility than comfort. No medieval knight was out there sighing dreamily about his ergonomic riding experience. And that brings us to something worth lingering on. Medieval saddles were surprisingly important weapons. Not in the literal sense, knights weren't riding around slapping people with saddles, but in the sense that saddles shaped how shock combat worked. A properly designed war saddle locked the knight in place, giving him stability when lowering a lance for a charge. Without them, he'd simply slide off the back like a sack of flour tossed onto a horse for comedic effect. So much of mounted combat's power came from staying seated, which isn't glamorous, but it is deeply medieval in its practicality. Let's float over to another myth, the idea that swords were the king of weapons. They weren't. In fact, they were often a secondary choice. Spears, lances, maces, axes, those did most of the battlefield work. Swords were the sidearms, the backups, the respectable, noble tools you carried not because they were the best, but because they were the status symbol. Sort of like how some people buy expensive watches today, not because they need to tell time, but because they want to quietly inform the world that they own an expensive watch. The sword's value was cultural first, practical second. Knights wrote about swords. They named swords. They passed them down. But they rarely depended on them as the primary tool in serious combat. It's the medieval equivalent of giving a fancy nickname to your expensive pen and then doing most of your writing with a regular pencil. Functional needs always win, no matter how poetic you feel. So when knights fought, most of the actual meaningful engagement happened with other weapons. Longer, heavier, more specialized. War hammers were excellent for punching dents into armor, and they did it without apology. Maces transferred force like a grumpy god of blunt trauma. Spears controlled the space between fighters, a kind of medieval social distancing but with significantly higher stakes. And axes, well, axes don't need introduction. They have one purpose in life, and they commit to it wholeheartedly. And oh, the heat. No one talks about the heat. The padded gambeson under the armor trapped warmth like a sauna that had strong opinions about personal space. The metal above it baked in sunlight. Knights sweated. A lot. The romantic image of a gleaming knight in polished plate leaves out the fact that he also probably smelled like a warm loaf of human misery by noon. Medieval warfare wasn't fragrant. Nor was it clean. There's a reason people prayed before battle, not just for survival, but perhaps also a little for patience with their own discomfort. Let's drift gently toward another quiet truth. Most medieval conflicts weren't full-scale battles. They were skirmishes, raids, ambushes, small engagements that involved a handful of fighters on each side. Big battles were actually relatively rare, and when they did happen, they were often catastrophically decided by terrain, communication failures, or somebody having a brilliant idea that turned out to be really, really terrible. Like knights charging uphill into spears, or infantry advancing into a marsh, or commanders deciding that the weather was probably not that bad, right before it flooded their camp and drowned half the morale. Medieval warfare involved many such moments. And in a sleepy, drifting way, it's comforting to know that even the great commanders of history made choices that would be politely described today as suboptimal. But one of the more misunderstood elements of medieval warfare is the psychological environment. Combat wasn't constant. It wasn't a blur of violence. It was waiting. Hours of waiting. Sometimes days. Soldiers spent far more time sitting in a field picking at their boots than they did swinging weapons. Fear built slowly. Anticipation stretched thin. People whispered, fidgeted, adjusted armor straps that didn't need adjusting. It's easy to imagine them telling themselves quiet little lies, like, this probably won't be so bad, or maybe the enemy will get tired and go home. And when combat finally did come, it was quick, sharp, loud, then over. Short bursts of chaos separated by long periods of uncomfortable reflection. If anything, medieval warfare was an exercise in managing boredom and anxiety more than anything else. That part rarely makes it into movies because extended scenes of soldiers awkwardly standing around don't sell tickets. But it's real. And in its own way, it paints a clearer picture of the medieval experience than any heroic duel ever could. Another thing that often gets lost in our modern imagination is the sheer inefficiency of communication. No radios. No quick messengers. Just shouting, flags, horns, and the hope that the wind didn't sweep your command into oblivion. Commanders frequently discovered that their army had misunderstood an order 15 minutes too late to fix anything. Units drifted off. Lines bent. Mistakes spiraled. This wasn't incompetence. It was just reality. Humans are noisy, chaotic creatures. And medieval battlefields were massive, unpredictable spaces. Let's drift now toward the role of shields. Shields seem simple, but they were one of the most important pieces of equipment any soldier carried. Whether round, kite-shaped, or heater-style, shields did more than block blows. They created formations. Walls of wood and leather that controlled the rhythm of combat. Shields protected legs, absorbed arrows, and shaped group tactics. They were, in a way, the quiet choreographers of medieval warfare. And when we talk about how medieval soldiers fought, shields explain a lot of it. Soldiers didn't stand around trading wide, dramatic swings. They hid behind shields, jabbed with spears, and edged forward or backward in a slow, grinding tide. It was methodical, predictable, which is to say, very much not like the movies. But even knights used shields, especially before full-plate armor became common. The idea of a knight charging into battle with only a sword and full armor is mostly fantasy. Shields were practical. And knights were nothing if not practical beneath all that lineage and ceremony. Speaking of lineage, it's time to drift briefly into the noble psychology of warfare again. For knights, combat was not only about survival. It was a stage, a place to be seen, a way to earn prestige. Capturing valuable opponents was as much a career advancement as defeating them. And perhaps one of the most quietly amusing parts of medieval warfare is how often knights recognized each other mid-battle and reacted like surprised colleagues bumping into one another at a conference. "Oh, you're here." "Yes. I'd prefer not to be. Shall we do this quickly?" "Please." Of course, the actual dialogue was more formal, but the sentiment was likely similar. There was an understanding, a professional courtesy, in a way. For all the brutality of the age, there were strange pockets of chivalric politeness tucked between the clashes. But let's drift back to the practicalities, because medieval warfare always returns to practicality. Consider the terrain. Terrain shaped everything. Mud ruined cavalry charges. Hills broke formations. Marshes turned battlefields into nightmares. Forests made it impossible to maneuver in formation. If you wanted to win, you chose good terrain. If you wanted to lose painfully and with great historical embarrassment, you ignored terrain entirely. And many commanders did. Which gives us another quietly soothing realization. Even in the Middle Ages, humans were still experimenting with the concept of thinking ahead. Let's float toward weapon maintenance next. Knights didn't walk into battle with brand new, pristine weapons shining like they stepped out of a catalog. Weapons had nicks, dents, imperfections. Soldiers sharpened blades, repaired hafts, rewrapped grips. It wasn't glamorous. It was routine. And sometimes, when things got really desperate, a weapon was used long past the point of elegance simply because it was all that remained intact. Another subtle reality. Weapons didn't always cooperate. Spears snapped. Sword tips broke. Axes got stuck. Lances shattered in ways that sent splinters into the rider's face. Medieval battles were full of these inconvenient little moments. The kind of things no chronicler bothered to mention because they didn't match the heroic tone. But they happened. Constantly. And as we drift toward the end of this part, it's worth noting one more quiet truth. Medieval warfare was not designed to be won by individual brilliance. It was won by cooperation, teamwork, cohesion. Knights liked to pretend otherwise, but even their greatest victories happened because someone else held the line, someone else blocked a blow, someone else lifted a shield over the right spot at the right time. Combat wasn't noble. It wasn't theatrical. It was a group project, just one with far more sweating and shouting. As you reflect on all this, let your mind drift softly over the battlefield again. Slow-moving figures. Careful steps. Measured strikes. Nothing glamorous. Everything real. In that quiet, subtle truth, there's something deeply human, and maybe even a little comforting. Before we float onward, tell me, if you had to choose one medieval weapon to carry into battle, knowing everything we've talked about, which would it be? Drop your answer in the comments, very gently. End of part 7. Tell me softly in the comments, Which medieval weapon suits your personality best? Let's drift back, once again, into the hush of medieval warfare. That strangely repetitive cycle of planning, sweating, regretting life decisions, and occasionally lying in mud while wondering how many poor choices led to this very moment. By now we've wandered through knights, weapons, armor, battlefields, and all the gentle disappointment that comes with discovering reality is never as dramatic as the illustrations. So tonight, let's float deeper still, into the slowest, sleepiest, and arguably the most passive-aggressive kind of medieval combat, the siege. Because if battles were bursts of exhaustion and adrenaline, sieges were the long, dull grind of waiting for someone else to give up first. They were less clash of armies, and more two sides staring at each other for weeks while everyone slowly loses the will to live. Perfect bedtime material. So settle in, breathe softly, and picture yourself leaning against a cold stone wall, watching a cluster of enemy tents on the horizon, knowing, deeply, truly, that nothing interesting is going to happen today. Or tomorrow. Or probably this month. That was the reality of most sieges. They were slow. Very slow. Slow enough to make snails look motivated. Contrary to movies, sieges were not constant bombardments, dramatic scaling ladders, and fiery trebuchet shots every 10 minutes. Cannons came later, of course, but even then they weren't the cinematic booms that Hollywood loves. For most of medieval history, siege warfare was simply about patience. The attacking army camped outside the walls. The defenders sat behind those walls. And both sides essentially waited to see whose food ran out first. This is not glamorous, but it is wonderfully soothing. Take, for example, the experience of being a soldier stationed on top of a battlement. You'd look out at the enemy camp. You'd see smoke from cooking fires, hear faint clinks of tools, maybe the occasional bored shout. Then you'd turn around to look at your own garrison, where someone was inevitably complaining about the lack of decent bread. And you'd realize, nothing is going to change. Not for a while. Soldiers passed the time mending gear, arguing over dice games, sharpening weapons that would not be used for several weeks, and occasionally throwing unpleasant things over the walls out of sheer spite. This last category ranged from rocks to boiling water to the contents of chamber pots, because medieval people had a wonderful dedication to pettiness. But let's drift deeper into the castle itself. Life inside a besieged fortress was slow, cramped, and gently miserable. Rations tightened. People grew irritable. Water had to be conserved. The smell, naturally, became an issue early on. The defenders constantly worried about disease, because there's only so long you can keep hundreds, or thousands, of people inside stone walls before someone inevitably gets sick. So it's no wonder the defenders occasionally stared longingly at the enemy camp, imagining fresh air and open fields, and thinking, surrendering doesn't sound that bad. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the attackers weren't exactly having a festive holiday. Living in a field, eating preserved food, listening to your fellow soldiers snore through thin tent walls, this was not anyone's idea of comfort. Armies often got restless. Some wandered off. Some deserted entirely. Nothing kills motivation quite like realizing your life is being spent in the noble service of waiting. Knights, especially, found sieges deeply unsatisfying. This was not what they trained for. There was no heroic charge, no dramatic duel, no chance to show off how shiny their armor was under the sun. Instead, they found themselves supervising engineers or digging ditches. Nothing says glory like manual labor. In this drowsy atmosphere of endurance and tedium, siege engineers were the real stars. They were the clever ones, the quiet ones, the ones who somehow convinced everyone that stacking logs in a specific shape would eventually lead to victory. These engineers designed and built siege towers, battering rams, mantlets, and of course, trebuchets. Ah yes, the trebuchet. The soft-spoken celebrity of medieval engineering. Everyone loves it. It's big, dramatic, and capable of launching something unpleasant across a long distance with astonishing force. But even trebuchet shots were slow and methodical. Each stone had to be positioned just right. The counterweight had to be lifted. The swing arm reset. It was powerful, yes, but it had the rhythm of a sleepy giant waking up slowly each morning. Trebuchets were used for more than attacking walls. Sometimes they launched rotting animal carcasses to spread disease. Sometimes burning barrels. Sometimes letters demanding surrender. And occasionally, if a commander felt particularly creative, the heads of captured soldiers. Medieval people were imaginative with their unpleasantness. But even trebuchets weren't used constantly. Ammunition took time. Resetting took time. And besides, the defending wall often shrugged off the impact unless it was one of many, many, many shots. Again, the theme here is slow persistence, not flashy action. Let's drift gently toward another staple of medieval sieges, tunnels. Because nothing says exciting military innovation like digging a hole under someone else's house. Sappers tunneled beneath castle walls, propped the underground chambers with wooden beams, and once everything was ready, set the beams on fire. The burning supports collapsed, the tunnel ceiling failed, and the wall above caved inward. At least, that was the plan. Sometimes the tunnel didn't go where it was supposed to. Sometimes the wall stubbornly refused to collapse. Sometimes defenders heard the digging and launched counter-tunnels. Imagine the deeply awkward moment when you meet the enemy in a cramped underground tunnel, both sides holding tiny torches and thinking, "This is not what I signed up for." Life outside the walls, too, had its risks. Disease was the greatest enemy of any besieging army. Soldiers lived in close quarters, drank questionable water, and ate whatever food they brought or scavenged. It's estimated that more people died of illness during sieges than from actual combat. This is the sort of statistic that medieval chroniclers often glossed over, because it didn't make for inspiring reading. But it does add a deeply relatable human note to the whole thing. Imagine falling sick, not from battle wounds, but from eating bad fish in a muddy field. We can drift now to one of the more curious siege strategies: psychological warfare. Medieval commanders understood that morale mattered just as much as fortifications. So they tried to frighten the defenders. Sometimes that meant showing off captured prisoners. Sometimes burning crops. Sometimes staging elaborate mock parades to make the attacking army seem far larger than it really was. Subtlety was not a strong point. But creativity? Absolutely. Inside the walls, defenders tried their own psychological tricks. They might throw fresh meat over the wall to show how well-stocked they were, or ring bells during the night to suggest cheerfulness, or appear atop the walls in especially bright clothing to project confidence. One chronicle even mentions a siege where the defenders baked fresh pies and deliberately let their scent drift toward the enemy camp. If you ever wondered whether medieval life involved petty, food-based intimidation, yes, it did. Let's drift toward what commanders feared most: winter. If a siege dragged into the cold months, everything became worse. Food spoiled. Fires were harder to maintain. Mud turned to ice. Water froze. Soldiers shivered in inadequate shelters. Horses weakened. The entire enterprise became a cold endurance contest, and even the most determined army sometimes packed up and left when the frost set in. Winter was not something you fought. It was something you survived. Yet, sometimes, sieges ended suddenly. Not through dramatic wall collapses or fiery assaults, but through negotiation. Medieval people negotiated constantly. A castle might surrender if the defenders were granted safe passage, or if the lord received a promise of ransom, or, occasionally, if someone important simply got bored. It's strangely refreshing to imagine two commanders quietly agreeing that all of this had dragged on long enough. Now, movies love to show the dramatic final assault, the scaling of ladders, the crashing of gates, the furious hand-to-hand combat inside the courtyard. These things did happen, but they weren't the everyday norm. Assaults were expensive, costly, risky. A commander might lose dozens or hundreds of men in minutes. So assaults were used sparingly, and normally only when everything else had failed. The medieval preference was always to wait, and wait, and wait some more. The thing about sieges is that they reveal the rhythms of medieval life better than battles ever could. The slowness, the patience, the mundane repetitive tasks, the quiet dread, the way people clung to tiny comforts, like a good meal or a warm corner of a barack. In these long, stagnant stretches of time, history becomes unexpectedly human. You can almost imagine the soldiers sitting around a fire, swapping stories, poking fun at their commanders, complaining about the weather, and wondering whether they'd ever see home again. There's a strange gentleness in this, an understanding that beneath all the armor, all the strategy, all the politics, most soldiers were simple people caught in complex situations, just trying to make it to the next sunrise. Let's drift now to something even quieter, the aftermath of a siege. If a castle resisted to the bitter end and was taken by storm, consequences could be grim. But if it surrendered peacefully, the aftermath might be surprisingly calm. Life resumed. Markets opened. People cleaned the walls. Repairs began. Chroniclers wrote versions of events that made their favorite side look good. And the world moved on. Sieges were slow, yes, but they were also strangely reflective. They forced people to confront their limits, their resilience, their fears. They were tests of endurance more than skill. And that gives them a certain sleep-friendly melancholy that fits our late-night wandering perfectly. As we float to the edge of this part, ask yourself, if you were trapped inside a medieval castle during a siege, would you hold out? Or would you quietly suggest to your commander that surrender was sounding more appealing by the hour? Let me know, softly, in the comments. End of Part 8. In a siege, would you be a patient defender, or the first to recommend negotiating? Drift your answer into the comments. Let's drift back into the soft, muted haze of our sleepy medieval landscape, where knights continue doing what knights have always done best, overestimating themselves in public, and then quietly regretting their decisions in private. At this point in our wandering nighttime exploration, we've looked at their weapons, their training, their unfortunate laundry situations, and even their battle tactics. Yet somehow, there's still more to uncover. That's the thing about the Middle Ages. It's an era that keeps giving, almost as if history itself wanted to make sure future generations never ran out of ironic bedtime stories. So let's drift a little further, deeper into the places where knightly fantasies officially met their limits: sieges, logistics, boredom, and the deeply unglamorous work of keeping a medieval army even faintly functional. Because for every shining moment of battlefield glory, there were weeks, sometimes months, of men sitting around, eating bad bread, complaining about the weather, and wishing someone would please invent hygiene. We rarely think about it, but most medieval warfare was not warfare at all. It was waiting. Endless waiting. Soldiers lounging around camps, sharpening things that didn't need sharpening, telling the same badly exaggerated stories, and quietly hoping the enemy didn't surprise them during a bathroom break. Knights, for all their pride and posture, spent most of their time not fighting. Instead, they performed daily tasks that would look suspiciously like hard labor disguised as honor. Which brings us gently, slowly, like a fog rolling in, to the heart of medieval warfare: sieges. Forget the dramatic cavalry charges. Forget the heroic duels. Battles were brief flickers. Sieges were the real fire, and they burned slowly, steadily, sometimes for seasons at a time, like a candle someone forgot to blow out. Picture a medieval siege, a castle looming on a hill, walls silent and expressionless, almost bored with the whole situation. An army gathered below, trying to look intimidating while also trying not to catch a cold. The defenders trapped inside, staring out from arrow slits with the resigned expression of people wondering why they ever trusted medieval architecture. Movies make sieges look like explosive spectacles, trebuchets firing non-stop, brave speeches, fire everywhere. Real sieges were mostly quiet, long, and deeply frustrating. Imagine sitting outside a stone wall waiting for the people inside to either surrender or starve, whichever happens first. Days passed without much happening at all. Then weeks. Then months. Soldiers built makeshift huts. Knights took off their armor because they realized it's difficult to nap in full plate. The camp slowly became a half-functional village filled with noise, smells, questionable cooking habits, and the kind of boredom that could drive a man to start whittling sticks for entertainment. Sieges were a test of patience more than anything else. And patience, unfortunately, was not something knights excelled at. They liked fast, decisive, glorious action. Sieges offered none of that. If anything, they offered the opposite. Days of nothing punctuated by sudden moments of chaos, an attempt to tunnel under the wall, a fire breaking out, a trebuchet collapsing at the worst possible moment, or someone inside the castle yelling rude things from the battlements just to relieve the monotony. One of the more misunderstood siege tactics was psychological warfare. Movies give us loud taunts, flaming pigs, dramatic displays. In reality, psychological warfare often looked like a group of soldiers banging on things, making noise, or threatening to cut off the castle's water supply. Or they'd build siege towers slowly and methodically, hoping the defenders were too tired to notice. Quiet intimidation was surprisingly effective. After all, If you were trapped inside a fortification while the enemy calmly built a giant wooden structure taller than your house, you'd probably start rethinking your life choices too. And the weapons of siege warfare, oh, they deserve their own sleepy spotlight. The trebuchet, for instance, is often romanticized as the superweapon of the Middle Ages. Which, to be fair, it was. But not because it fired rocks with dramatic flair. No, it was feared because trebuchets were the medieval equivalent of someone politely knocking on your door by throwing a boulder through your living room. Slowly. Repeatedly. 4 weeks. Nothing says, you should surrender now, quite like waking up every day to structural damage you can't repair. Trebuchets could launch stones, firepots, diseased animals, and sometimes even messages. Yes, medieval people occasionally communicated by catapult. Nothing says diplomacy like hurling a note attached to a rock at high velocity. The message probably lost some of its nuance on impact. But building a trebuchet wasn't a dramatic montage. It required carpenters, engineers, ropes, wheels, beams, counterweights, and more patience than any knight naturally possessed. Every component had to be tested and adjusted. If the counterweight was too heavy, it would break the frame. If the sling was wrong, the projectile would fly straight up or backward, both of which are excellent ways to ruin morale. Let's drift gently back into the soft haze of the medieval battlefield, long after the noise has ended. The dust has settled. The shouting has faded into a tired murmur. The horses have stopped panicking, mostly, and everyone still standing is quietly wondering whether they'll ever be able to unclench their shoulders again. It's a strange time, this aftermath. Not quite victory, not quite peace. More like the medieval version of that awkward silence after a family argument, when no one quite knows where to look. By now, throughout these long, slow wanderings, you've probably noticed something. Medieval warfare wasn't really about the drama. It wasn't about heroics or poetic last stands or impossibly choreographed duels. It was about effort, weight, sweat, and the deeply human desire to simply survive long enough to get home, sit down, and pretend none of it ever happened. But the aftermath tells a quieter story. A softer one. A story not often shown in films because it isn't dramatic enough. And yet, in these quieter moments, the truth of medieval warfare becomes clearest. The aftermath began almost immediately after the battle's momentum broke. Soldiers who'd spent the last hour swinging weapons now stood panting, leaning on spears or shields, discovering that their arms felt like pudding. Knights staggered off horses that were just as exhausted and probably in a worse mood. The noise dropped to whispers. Armor clattered with the slow heaviness of people who suddenly realized they still had to walk somewhere. One of the first tasks was always the same: checking who was alive. And because medieval battles were often chaotic, this process was less heroic rescue and more a very tired man poking vaguely at lumps on the ground. Sometimes the lumps groaned. Sometimes they swore. Sometimes they said something about being owed a drink. And sometimes, of course, they didn't say anything at all. But the checking was essential, because medieval commanders needed to know which captains had survived, which nobles could be ransomed, and which soldiers could still be yelled at in the morning. There's a particular stillness to this moment. Horses snorting softly. The faint clinking of armor as knights stretch stiff arms. Somewhere in the distance, a wounded soldier calls for water. It's not triumphant. It's not tragic. It's just weary and deeply human. And then, naturally, there were the knights who hoped not to be recognized. Because capture wasn't always a dignified affair. Sometimes a knight lay on his back, armor dented, helmet twisted sideways, trying to decide whether it was worth the effort to roll over. If an enemy soldier found him and recognized the crest on his shield, the knight might find himself gently informed that he would be paying a very large sum of money for the privilege of going home alive. The ransom system was, in its own way, a polite business arrangement conducted between people who had just spent several hours attempting to stab each other. And medieval nobles took it surprisingly well. Being captured wasn't shameful. It was basically professional inconvenience. Like being stuck at the office late because your coworker misfiled something. You weren't dead. You weren't disgraced. You were just temporarily detained by someone with better aim. But the ordinary soldiers, the ones without estates or delicate embroidered crests, had different concerns. They searched for friends, for commanders, for lost helmets. They scavenged weapons because a spear was a spear, and a battlefield was basically a medieval yard sale. You could find almost anything lying around: arrows, daggers, abandoned shields, the occasional disgruntled rooster that had somehow wandered into the chaos earlier. If you ever wondered why armies after major battles were described as reorganized, this is why. Everyone's equipment was suddenly just slightly wrong. Nothing matched anymore. Let's drift over to the less glamorous side of the aftermath, the cleanup. Because medieval chroniclers loved writing about the glory of war, but they never devoted much ink to the people who had to pick up broken weapons, drag away bodies, and deal with the horses who were absolutely done cooperating for the day. And yet, cleanup was one of the most important tasks. If the battlefield was left as is, it attracted scavengers, animals, and the general discomfort of everyone living nearby. Some bodies were recovered by their comrades. Some were collected by local villagers, who viewed the battlefield as an unfortunate but temporary disruption to their daily routine. Medieval people were used to seeing death. They didn't enjoy it, but they understood it. They approached it with a resigned practicality that feels strangely calming in its quiet acceptance. No theatrics. No sweeping orchestral music. Just the slow, necessary work of restoring order. And then there were the wounded. The lucky ones had comrades who would help them limp back to camp. The less lucky ones might attempt the journey alone, dragging themselves along with whatever limbs still cooperated. Medieval medicine wasn't hopeless, but it also wasn't exactly inspiring. Treatments ranged from surprisingly smart to bafflingly questionable. Washing wounds with wine was actually quite effective. Magical charms recited over injuries, slightly less so. But the important thing is that people tried. They did their best with what they had. And sometimes, their best was just barely enough. Surgeons, actual surgeons, not barbers pretending to be surgeons, worked quickly. They knew that hesitation meant infection. They stitched, bandaged, braced, and occasionally removed things that clearly didn't belong inside the human body. Their hands were steady but tired. Their supplies limited. Yet they worked on, knowing that every saved soldier meant one more man who wouldn't be mourned at dusk. The evenings after battles were strangely calm. The campfires flickered quietly. Men spoke in hushed voices, not out of reverence but out of exhaustion. Dinner, if it could be called that, usually consisted of whatever rations survived the chaos. Sometimes it was bread. Sometimes cheese. Sometimes something so questionably edible that even the horses refused it. But hungry men aren't picky men. They ate. They drank water or wine if they were lucky. And then they slept. Or tried to. Sleep after battle wasn't peaceful. Some men dreamt. Some didn't. Some stared at the ceiling of their tents, wondering whether they'd be on another field soon. The commanders, meanwhile, discussed the next steps. They inspected the casualties. They wrote letters to superiors explaining why things had gone wrong, or why they had gone right purely due to their genius strategic leadership, depending on how honest they felt that evening. Medieval command was a delicate balance between competence and confident storytelling. And usually, confidence won. The next day, armies rarely lingered. Staying near a battlefield for too long was a good way to catch diseases no one had names for yet. So they marched on. And as they walked, some men spoke about the battle as if it were a great victory. Others described it as a horrible mess. Both perspectives were true, in their own sleepy way. The medieval battlefield was neither glorious nor meaningless. It simply was. A part of life. A job. A cyclical rhythm of preparation, fighting, recovering, moving on. Let's drift lightly toward the topic that most films ignore entirely: morale. Because nothing shaped medieval warfare more than morale, and nothing evaporated faster. When an army won, morale soared for about a day. Then everyone remembered their boots still didn't fit right, their rations were stale, and they were marching again tomorrow. Joy was short-lived. But fear was even shorter. Men moved past it because there was work to do. And in that steady movement, you find the real heartbeat of medieval conflict. Not the charge. Not the clash. But the return to routines. The aftermath also revealed who truly held authority. A noble might command by rank, but the men who actually held units together were the seasoned veterans, the sergeants, the lieutenants, the gray-bearded professionals who knew when to bark an order and when to let tired soldiers sit for a moment. These quiet leaders kept armies functional. They didn't care about glory. They cared about logistics. They understood that an exhausted army was a defeated army, even if it had technically won the last battle. Their calm, steady presence shaped outcomes more than any heroic charge ever could. And here's something few people think about: the smell. Movies never capture it. The scent of trampled grass, crushed dirt, sweat, leather, blood, smoke, horses, and the faint but unmistakable odor of 1,000 men who had not bathed recently enough to satisfy modern hygiene standards. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. And familiarity, strangely enough, was comforting. It meant they were still alive, still together, still moving forward. Sometimes, after a battle, armies met civilians, villagers watching cautiously from a distance. Some came to sell food to the victors. Others came to search for lost relatives. Still others came simply because curiosity has always been stronger than caution. These interactions tell a gentler story. Ordinary people who didn't care about borders or kings or claims. They cared about grazing fields, livestock, the price of grain. To them, armies were both frightening and boring. A disruption. A reminder that the world beyond their village existed, even if they never wanted to visit it. And as we drift to the end of this part, it's worth remembering that medieval warfare, for all its brutality, was sustained by people who valued routine. They fought. They endured. They healed. They marched. And somewhere in between, they found space for laughter, for complaints, for the small, quiet joys that made life tolerable. If you had been there, standing in the soft haze after the battle, hearing only the distant crackle of campfires, what would you have done first? Rest. Eat. Search for friends? Or simply sit down and sigh? Let me know softly in the comments. End of part 10. Tell me, what part of the medieval aftermath surprised you most? Let's drift back once more into the soft haze of medieval warfare, slowly, gently, like someone trying not to disturb a cat sleeping on their lap. By this point in our long journey together, we've peeled back most of the illusions that cling to knights and their weapons. The shining armor, the noble duels, the elegant swordplay, all of it is, well, a little exaggerated. Or a lot exaggerated. But that's all right. Exaggeration is one of humanity's favorite hobbies. Right next to complaining about taxes and pretending we understand poetry. So before we wrap up our wander through armor, weapons, and the gently disappointing reality of medieval combat, let's drift through one more set of quiet reflections, those softer corners of warfare that don't make dramatic stories, but do make strangely calming late-night thoughts. Because after all the clashing and clanking, what did a battle look like after the noise stopped? Not cinematic triumph music. Not heroic slow-motion walks. Just tired people. Knights sinking to sit on whatever surface didn't have spikes sticking out of it. Pages running around trying to bring water before someone fainted in their armor. Horses shaking dust from their manes with the same expression every horse has ever had, mild disappointment in humans. And the battlefield itself? Mostly mud, churned by hooves and boots. Abandoned weapons. Broken arrows. A lance that snapped in such a dramatic fashion that the knight probably claimed later it happened in an epic duel, when really he just angled it wrong into the ground. The aftermath wasn't glorious. It was quiet, heavy, almost meditative, if you ignored the injuries and existential crises. Let's drift gently into the idea of knightly honor. That lovely, romantic concept plastered over so many medieval stories. Did it exist? Yes. Did it always exist? No. Much like modern customer service, it depended heavily on who you asked and what mood they were in at the time. Honor mattered in tournaments, in courtly settings, in poems, and in the kinds of social gatherings where everyone wanted to pretend they were more noble than they actually were. But on the battlefield, honor was sometimes gently placed to the side, like a fancy coat someone didn't want to ruin. You did what needed to be done. You protected your own. You avoided risks that weren't worth the glory. You aimed for captures when possible because a ransom meant far more than a kill. Knights understood this balance, even if storytellers often ignored it. It's difficult to craft an inspiring poem about someone who strategically chose the easiest target and avoided everyone who looked too confident. Let's drift now toward the camp, the place where knights spent far more time than they ever did fighting. The camp was where real medieval life unfolded. It was where armor was repaired, where squires practiced drills and regretted every decision that led them to this career path, where knights complained about rations, taxation, weather, and each other, where men played dice badly, drank poorly made ale, and argued over things that made absolutely no difference in the grand scheme of history. If battles were the punctuation marks of medieval warfare, camps were the long, wandering sentences between them. Long, slow, comfortable in their monotony. The kind of monotony we don't mind too much when we're half asleep and listening to someone describe it softly. Weapons in camp were treated very differently than weapons on the battlefield. Swords weren't always polished works of art. They were often chipped, dulled, slightly bent from impacts that no one had time to fix properly. Men mended things quickly, not perfectly. No one wanted to spend hours sharpening a blade when they knew it would be dulled again tomorrow. And knights weren't always as impressive in camp as people imagine. Some were dignified. Some were lazy. Some snored loudly enough to frighten nearby animals. One chronicler even complained that the sound of noblemen snoring in their tents during a campaign was like thunder in the mountains. Which is probably the most honest description of medieval warfare that exists. Let's drift toward armor maintenance, which was less glamorous than most people picture. Armor rusted easily. Sweat corroded metal. Rain caused problems. Mud stuck everywhere, especially in places steel plates weren't meant to bend. Keeping armor in good condition was a daily task, handled mostly by squires, servants, and smiths, not by the knights themselves. Knights preferred to supervise, usually while complaining that their armor felt heavier than yesterday, which was probably true, given how much mud it collected. But despite these inconveniences, medieval armor did something extraordinary. It kept people alive. Not perfectly. Not painlessly, but effectively enough that many knights survived battles with only bruises, cracked ribs, or the occasional broken nose. Which, considering the alternatives, is rather impressive. And so we drift gently toward the last major idea in this long, sleepy exploration, the truth that medieval warfare was rarely glorious, rarely elegant, and rarely what we imagine. The weapons were tools. The armor was protection, not costume. The knights were human, flawed, tired, often scared, and sometimes surprisingly practical. Which, in its own strange way, makes the Middle Ages feel more relatable. More real. Less like a distant, unreachable legend, and more like a time when people struggled through challenges using whatever knowledge they had, even when that knowledge wasn't perfect. They improvised, adapted, survived, complained, ate mediocre bread, and wrote poems insisting that everything was far more glamorous than it really was. That's human nature, after all. As we come to the close of this long, drifting journey through medieval combat, take a moment to imagine knights not as flawless warriors, but as men in heavy armor doing their best not to fall over. Imagine the weight of a sword in your hand, not featherlight, not unwieldy, just solid. Imagine the thudding heartbeat in your chest before a battle. The quiet relief after it ended. The long sigh as you sat in the grass, wiped sweat from your brow, and wondered whether it was too early to ask someone for more water. History often feels dramatic, but in truth, it is filled with countless small, mundane moments layered between the grand events. And somehow, those smaller moments tell us more about the past than any heroic tale ever could. So here, at the end, let's drift down gently from the battlefield. The armor grows quiet. The torches flicker lower. The horses settle. The knights retire to their tents. And the world relaxes back into the slow, sleepy rhythm it had before someone decided that conflict was a good idea. Before we wrap up completely, I want to invite you, softly, calmly, to share something in the comments. After everything we've explored, every weapon, every tactic, every myth unraveled, if you lived in medieval times, which role would you have chosen? Knight, archer, squire, or something far more peaceful? Let me know in the comments. Closing remarks, soft, sleepy outro. Thank you for drifting through this long journey with me tonight. If you're still awake, I'm genuinely impressed. And if you're asleep, well, I hope the medieval knights aren't chasing you in your dreams. They'd never catch you anyway. Armor is heavy. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration, this slow, drifting unraveling of myths and reality, feel free to like the video, subscribe for more sleepy history, and gently tap the notification bell so the next late-night story finds you when you need it. And before you go, leave me one last thought in the comments. What part of medieval warfare surprised you the most tonight? Sleep well, traveler. And as always, we'll drift back into history again, very soon.